You wake in darkness, though you are not sure if you were ever truly asleep. The air is heavy with the sour blend of sweat, oil, and fear. The stone beneath your skin bites with its chill, and your body protests even the smallest movement. Bruises bloom across your ribs like grotesque flowers, purple fading into yellow, and the iron cuff around your ankle has worn the skin raw. You shift slightly, and flakes of dried blood scatter to the floor like brittle petals. Then, footsteps, heavy sandals striking marble in a steady rhythm. You know this sound too well. The overseer, the figure whose presence has defined every day since the night you were brought here. The door scrapes open. A blade of sunlight slices into the gloom, blinding after so many hours in darkness. You squint, shielding your eyes with a trembling hand. His shadow fills the doorway, vast, scarred, and immovable. His face is a tapestry of old wounds, each one a story of cruelty inflicted and endured. "Clean yourself," he growls, throwing a damp cloth at your feet. "The master has guests tonight." He does not need to explain. You understand. You have always understood. From the first night you were dragged from your village, kicking and screaming, the truth was plain. You were no longer a child, no longer a person. You were property. 15 years old. Though you stopped counting birthdays long ago. Your throat tightens. You gather the thin tunic from the corner, your hands trembling. He watches with the cold calculation of a horse trader assessing livestock. His gaze strips you, not only of clothing but of dignity, of any remnants of selfhood you might cling to. This, they say, is service. But the truth is darker. Behind the marble temples and the speeches about democracy, there is a Greece most people prefer to forget. We are taught of Plato and Socrates, of Pericles and the glory of Athens, of columns rising against the blue sky like the bones of gods. But the sunlight blinds us to the shadows beneath. The reality was not only debate and philosophy but also hunger, debt, and human suffering. The flesh and spirit of the vulnerable consumed to maintain the comfort of the elite. You are one of countless boys swept into this hidden world. Some were taken as spoils of war, captured when one city burned another to the ground. Some were handed over to pay off debts their families could never escape, and some, like you, were simply born too beautiful in a society that saw beauty as a resource to be traded, like olive oil or wine. History often remembers Greece as the cradle of freedom, but that freedom was reserved for a narrow circle, free male citizens, men with leisure and land. For them, philosophy, politics, and art flourished, but the leisure that allowed them to contemplate the meaning of virtue was purchased at a terrible price, the silence of those who had no choice. And so, in this chamber that smells of despair, you prepare yourself once more. The laughter of the free echoes faintly from the grand house above, a sound that tightens your stomach into knots. You know that when the guests arrive tonight, you will not serve wine or food alone. You will serve yourself. Your life, your body, your very name are no longer yours. You are an echo in the shadows of a civilization that celebrates liberty while thriving on chains. Long before you stood in a windowless chamber with chains around your ankles, the story began in a small village where survival balanced on a knife's edge. The land was your family's wealth, but land in Greece was unforgiving. Too much sun, and the crops withered. Too much rain, and the soil eroded into useless clay. In years of plenty, the village survived. In years of famine, survival itself became a debt paid in flesh. Picture your home. A valley ringed with olive groves, the houses of mud brick and thatch, goats wandering between them as children laughed barefoot in the dust. The air carried the smell of bread baking on open stones, mingling with the bleating of livestock and the rhythmic grind of millstones as women prepared grain. Life was harsh, yes, but it had its rhythms, its moments of sweetness. Families clung to one another. Festivals lit the night with torches and music. Even hardship felt survivable when endured together. Then came the drought. The sun baked the land mercilessly. Crops shriveled, barley fields turned brittle and brown, and even the ancient olive trees, twisted guardians of centuries, bore only shriveled fruit. Wells that had sustained your ancestors for generations ran dry, leaving cracked earth and silent buckets. In such times, families turned to desperate measures. Livestock was sold, first the goats and sheep that represented both wealth and milk. Then the jewelry went, the heirlooms passed from grandmother to mother to daughter. When even those were gone, fathers began to look at their children differently, not as hope, but as collateral. The merchants always arrived at the right moment, vultures who could smell despair from miles away. They came with their ledgers and scales, with ropes coiled like snakes, with silver coins clinking in pouches that glittered brighter than tears. They offered contracts 20 years of service for enough silver to keep a family alive through winter. It was a cruel bargain disguised as generosity. You were 12 the day the merchant examined your teeth as though you were a horse. His hands were rough as he prodded your arms, testing for strength, noting the promise of youth. Your father's eyes refused to meet yours. Your mother turned away, her hand pressed over her mouth to silence her sobs. The man wrote something in his ledger, a mark beside your name. You did not yet understand what it meant. The coins were counted out into your father's trembling hands. Each piece of silver caught the sunlight, and you felt the weight of years vanish into your buyer's purse. Every coin was a year of your life sold, a year of your childhood erased. They told you it was temporary, that you would learn skills, perhaps even earn enough to return home as a man of means. Perhaps you would buy land, perhaps take a wife. The words dripped like honey, sweet enough to mask the poison beneath. But you could see the truth in your mother's eyes as she refused to look at you. You could hear it in your father's silence. The truth was that your childhood had ended, not with a celebration, but with a transaction, and you were not alone. Across the Greek countryside, families in debt or desperation gave up their children to creditors and merchants. Wars fed the same system. Every captured city brought new waves of slaves, each one a prize of conquest. Beauty itself was dangerous. A boy or girl with striking features could be stolen outright, taken from a field, a market, even a festival, their fate sealed before their family had time to resist. Greek society celebrated freedom and democracy, but only for the few. For the rest, for women, foreigners, and the poor, freedom was fragile, a privilege that could vanish in a moment of crisis. The day you left, the village was quiet. Neighbors turned away as though your family's shame might infect them. Children you had played with stared with wide, confused eyes. You tried to walk proudly, but your legs shook as chains linked you to other boys. Some cried for their mothers, their voices hoarse until the overseers silenced them with blows. You did not cry. You only watched your father's back as he counted the silver, as if he could not bear to look at the child he had just sold. The last sound you heard from your mother was a muffled sob. The last sight was her veil hiding her face. That silence, that shame, was louder than any scream. And so the price of survival was paid not in coin, not in goats or grain, but in you. The journey began at dawn, when the sky was still streaked with the pale grey of morning. Iron collars were clasped around your neck, a chain linking you to the boy ahead, another chain binding you to the one behind. The links were heavy, their weight more than metal. It was the sound of freedom closing, the slow chime of doors locking one after another. You marched barefoot, the stones cutting into your soles until blisters split and bled. The older boys walked silently, faces empty, already hollowed by knowledge of what awaited. The younger ones cried until their voices gave out, or until the overseer's staff silenced them. Tears dried quickly under the unforgiving sun, leaving only swollen eyes and cracked lips. The landscapes you crossed should have been beautiful. Olive groves shimmered silver green in the breeze. The sea sparkled along the coast like spilled gemstones. Eagles soared over mountain passes, yet none of it touched you. Your world shrank to the clinking of chains, the rhythm of footsteps, the dust in your throat, and the ache in your shoulders. At night, the caravan was tethered like cattle. Iron stakes were driven into the earth, and chains fastened each boy in place. You lay in the dirt, your head turned toward the stars, wondering if your family was looking at the same constellations. Around you, muffled sobs broke the silence. No one spoke of escape. Hope was a word too dangerous to utter. Sometimes, strangers came to inspect the merchandise. Men with soft hands and calculating eyes walked the line of chained bodies, poking, prodding, assessing. You quickly learned to recognize them. The farmers looked for muscle-broad shoulders, strong legs. Household buyers searched for obedience, fragility, beauty that promised compliance. And then there were the others, the ones dressed in silk, perfumed, their rings glinting in lamplight. Their gaze lingered, not with the curiosity of a buyer of workers, but with hunger. Those were the visits you dreaded most. Finally, you reached Athens. If the march was despair, the market was its stage. The noise hit first, hundreds of voices, shouting, prices, orders, laughter. Then the stench, sweat, fear, urine, unwashed bodies, and then the sight, rows of human beings displayed like livestock, children barely able to walk, clutching their mothers' skirts, old men with bent backs and clouded eyes, young women, eyes wide with terror, as buyers discussed them openly, as though they could not hear. You were stripped, scrubbed, and rubbed with oil until your skin gleamed. Not out of kindness, but to increase your value. Shining bodies sold for more silver. You were lined up with others of your age, the household category, not field slaves, not artisans, but those destined for more intimate service. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the square, declaring your age, your strength, your gentle temperament. Code words. They made certain men lean forward with sudden interest. Bidding began, voices calling higher and higher, until one name rang clear, Lysander. You would not learn much about him then. Only the satisfied smile as he counted out coins, the way his eyes possessed you before the sale was even complete. He was well fed, his tunic dyed in purple that screamed of wealth. His hands were soft, untouched by labor. He looked at you not as a person, not even as a servant, but as a prize newly added to his collection. Behind him, Athens rose in marble splendor. Temples gleamed white against the blue sky. Columns stood like guardians of civilization, proclaiming to the world that here was the city of democracy, philosophy, theater, and reason. Travelers would write of its beauty for centuries. And yet, beneath those columns, in that very marketplace, children were sold like livestock. It was not a contradiction to them. It was the foundation. The wealth that built those temples, the leisure that filled those schools of philosophy, the freedom that citizens boasted of, all of it rested on the backs of slaves. Your back. The chains were removed. A new chain replaced them, invisible but no less binding. Ownership. You had been bought, your name erased, your life rewritten. Athens, the city of light, had welcomed you, but only into its shadows. Lysander's house was a world unto itself, larger than your entire village, built to remind every visitor of his wealth. Marble columns lined the entrance, their surfaces polished so bright they reflected the afternoon sunday. Painted frescoes sprawled across the walls, depicting gods and heroes in triumph. The floors shimmered with mosaics, tiny stones arranged into images of battles, feasts, and divine lovers. Beauty was everywhere, and yet it felt cruel, because you already sensed that this beauty was built on someone else's suffering. Inside, servants scurried like shadows. Their steps were quick, their eyes lowered, their silence heavy. You noticed something unsettling. Most of them were young men, beautiful young men, each bearing the same weary look, the same hollowed gaze that seemed to whisper, "I was once like you." You were handed over to Demetrius, the overseer. His presence was chilling, not for its brute strength alone, but for the cold precision in his voice. He was once a slave himself, but through ruthless obedience he had clawed his way into authority. Now, he was the one who enforced order in the household, who made sure that others bent until they broke. Demetrius led you down long corridors, explaining the rules as though reciting a sacred text. You would be fed twice daily barley porridge at dawn, bread and olives in the evening. You would receive clean clothing once a week, bathe when commanded, sleep when permitted. You would speak only if addressed. You would never look a free person in the eye. You would never refuse an order. And then came the words that made your blood freeze. "You are here," Demetrius said, his lips curling into something between a smile and a sneer, "to serve the master and his guests in whatever capacity they require. Food, wine, music, companionship, and other forms of entertainment." He did not need to explain further. His meaning was clear. Your quarters were in the basement, a series of small stone cells with straw mattresses, thin blankets, and chamber pots. The walls were thick, built to muffle sound. You would soon understand why. The other slaves greeted you cautiously, their faces mirrors of pain. Marcus was your age, though he carried the weight of 2 years in the house. His eyes were deep pools of sorrow, the kind no boy should know. Alexios was older, scarred across his back, a map of punishments endured. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were edged with warning. And then there was Philemon, barely 14, yet his face was already hollowed like an old man's. He had once been the son of a merchant, but when his father's business failed, creditors had seized everything, even the children. It was Philemon who told you what really happened in the house when symposium nights arrived. He spoke in whispers, as though the walls themselves might betray him. "They bathe us, oil us, dress us in thin tunics that cling to the body. Sometimes they give us jewelry not to honor us, but to display us, like ornaments. He described the knights, philosophers, politicians, generals reclining on couches, discussing poetry and politics, while slaves poured wine and laid out dishes. To the outside world, these gatherings were the pinnacle of Greek culture, the crucible of democracy and reason. But Philemon's voice grew tight as he explained how quickly the talk soured when wine flowed too freely. The debates end, the laughter turns sharp, and then their eyes turn to us. He did not need to say more. You listened in silence, a knot forming in your chest. You had grown up hearing elders praise Athens as the heart of civilization, the place where free men built a new kind of society. Yet here you were, staring at the cracked stone walls of your cell, realizing that the same men who argued about virtue by day could demand the destruction of innocence by night. The house was not merely a residence, it was a machine. Every polished surface, every painted god, every shining mosaic hid a system designed to strip away identity, to reduce people into property. Demetrius was its engineer, Lysander was its master, and you, along with Marcus, Alexios, Philemon, and countless others, were the fuel that kept it running. That night, as you lay on your straw bed, you listened. From beyond the walls came faint echoes, laughter above, muffled sobs nearby. You closed your eyes, trying to remember your mother's face, the sound of your father's voice. But already, those memories felt fragile, slipping through your fingers like sand. The house of Lysander had swallowed you, and in its depths, you began to understand that survival here would demand more than obedience. It would demand the slow sacrifice of the self. The night of your first symposium arrived with the weight of inevitability. Demetrius entered the basement with a smile that never reached his eyes. He ordered you and several others to wash, then directed older slaves to rub your skin with fragrant oil until it gleamed. The tunic they gave you was so thin it barely concealed your body. A necklace of bronze beads was draped around your neck, not as adornment, but as a collar made beautiful. Philemon's warnings echoed in your ears. They do not want servants, they want entertainment. Upstairs, the house was transformed. Couches lined the symposium hall, their cushions embroidered in bright colors. Bronze lamps flickered against painted walls, casting shadows over mosaics that showed gods reclining with mortals. Trays of roasted meats, olives, honey cakes, and bowls of wine filled the tables. The air was thick with the mingling scents of incense, food, and perfume. At first, it seemed almost innocent. Guests reclined, cups in hand, debating politics and philosophy. They spoke of the new military campaigns, of justice in the courts, of whether virtue was something taught or innate. Their words were lofty, their laughter refined. You poured wine, served figs, tried to move unnoticed, but you soon learned the rhythm of these nights. As the wine flowed, words grew looser, laughter sharper, the atmosphere shifting from dignity to indulgence. What had begun as philosophy dissolved into bawdy jokes and crude boasts. And then, inevitably, their eyes turned toward the slaves moving silently at the edges of the room. The first commands seemed harmless. Pour more wine, massage my shoulders, bring me grapes. Each task wrapped in the appearance of service. But the hands that lingered on your arms, the looks that measured you as though you were less human than the goblet in their grasp, told you where this would lead. When one guest, old enough to be your grandfather, beckoned you closer, your pulse thundered in your ears. His words were gentle, at first. He asked about your homeland, about your family. He pressed a cup into your hands and insisted you drink with him. His hand rested on your shoulder, then slid lower. You tried to shift away, but his grip tightened, his smile never faltering. Around you, conversation dulled, eyes turning toward the spectacle. Your protests were ignored, your resistance laughed at. What followed marked the true end of your childhood, not the sale, not the chains, but this moment, when the men celebrated as philosophers and statesmen reduced you to an object for their amusement. Afterward, you lay awake in your cell, staring at the ceiling. The bruises would heal, but the knowledge would not. You were not a boy anymore, not even a person. You were a possession, a tool for pleasure, and yet, even as you wept silently, the contradictions of the night burned in your mind. These men had quoted Homer and Plato while humiliating children. They debated virtue while committing cruelty. They toasted democracy while denying humanity to the very people who served their wine. Philemon had been right. The symposium was not a place of enlightenment. It was a theatre of hypocrisy. To the world, Athens was the cradle of reason. But in the house of Lysander, reason was drowned in wine, and justice was silenced beneath laughter. From that night on, the symposium hall was no longer a place of wonder. It was a stage where your body was no longer yours, where every command carried the threat of shame, where the applause of men masked the quiet sobs of slaves. And every time you stepped into that hall, you carried the knowledge that beneath the marble columns and golden lamps, beneath the words of democracy and philosophy, there was only this: power devouring the powerless. The weeks after your first symposium blurred into a rhythm of survival. Every dawn brought uncertainty. Would today mean routine service, fetching bread, cleaning floors, or would Demetrius summon you upstairs, where the guests waited with wine and demands? The not knowing was the cruelest part. Fear gnawed more deeply when it had no shape. Some tried to resist. Marcus, desperate to escape, slipped out one night into the courtyard, only to be caught before he reached the gate. They beat him so severely he limped for weeks, a walking lesson to the rest of you. Alexios once refused a guest's degrading order. They chained him in the open yard without food or water for 3 days, his skin blistered by the Sunday. He returned, broken, his silence louder than any cry. You learned quickly that resistance was not only punished, it was crushed, systematically. Demetrius understood better than anyone that fear alone was not enough. To break a person completely, you had to take more than their freedom. You had to erase their identity. The first step was the name. The one given to you by your parents was forbidden, replaced by a Greek one chosen for its pleasing sound. Then came the language. Speaking in your native tongue was met with swift punishment. Songs, stories, even whispered memories of home were dangerous. Slowly, the sound of your own culture faded from your ears. They dressed you in Greek clothes, forced you to eat Greek food, demanded you honor Greek gods. At first, you resisted in small ways, holding back words of prayer to your ancestors, imagining your mother's cooking when you chewed their bread. But over time, even imagination dulled. What they couldn't beat from you, they smothered. Isolation deepened the process. Your cell was stone thick enough to muffle screams, but not so thick that you couldn't hear the faint echoes of others. Sometimes you caught the sound of sobbing, sometimes laughter thin, hysterical, the sound of a spirit unraveling. You shared glances and whispers with Marcus, Philemon, and Alexios when you could, but those bonds were fragile. Demetrius encouraged betrayal by rewarding informants. Even friendship could be twisted into another form of control. The unpredictability wore you down most of all. Days of silence followed by sudden summons. A harsh word when you had done nothing wrong. A rare kindness when you least expected it. Your body remained tense always, braced for punishment or humiliation. Over time, you flinched even when no one touched you. You began to understand why some gave up completely. A boy in the cell next to yours stopped eating 1 week. He lay down on his straw bed and never rose again. Death was not an enemy to him, it was release. Demetrius replaced him within days, as though he had been nothing more than a broken tool. And yet, not all resistance was crushed. Some slaves retreated into themselves so deeply that nothing could reach them. They served wine with blank faces, endured cruelty with eyes empty as glass. Others learned cunning, anticipating moods and bending before the whip could fall. A few whispered stories in the dark fragments of songs, memories of festivals, names of those already lost. These whispers were acts of defiance, tiny flames of humanity kept alive where none was meant to burn. You began to notice something about the guests as well. They were not faceless monsters. They were men celebrated in Athens, philosophers who spoke of virtue, politicians who praised justice, merchants who funded temples and theatres. Their names would echo through history as pillars of civilization. And yet, in Lysander's hall, they revealed appetites that would curdle the admiration of any admirer. Dionysos, the politician, quoted Homer while humiliating boys. Cleomenes, the merchant, called his cruelty education. A philosopher, one whose works on ethics would be copied for generations, justified every abuse with elaborate arguments, twisting words until wrong sounded like reason. They did not see contradiction. In their minds, virtue was for equals. Slaves were not equals. You were property, outside the circle of morality. Their world allowed them to celebrate reason while practicing barbarity, and never once did they see the irony. And that was the final cruelty. Not just the pain, not just the erasure of your name, your voice, yourself, but the knowledge that those who hurt you would be remembered as wise men. Their marble statues would stand long after your body turned to dust. Their words would be studied, while yours would vanish unspoken. This was how the spirit was broken, not with a single blow, but with the slow grinding of years, with chains both visible and invisible, with laughter above and silence below, with the realization that history itself was not on your side. Time in Lysander's house stopped belonging to days and nights. It became a cycle of duties, humiliations, and small mercies so fleeting they barely felt real. The boy who had once run through olive groves was gone. In his place was someone else quieter, watchful, careful with every movement. You became what Demetrius called a perfect servant. You anticipated commands before they were spoken. You poured wine with steady hands. You endured without resistance. To the household, you were reliable, invisible, useful. To yourself, you were no longer certain what you were at all. The change did not go unnoticed. You were rewarded with marginal comforts, an extra scrap of bread, a tunic of better cloth, even a cell with a small window through which the sky appeared as a pale, mocking square. Other slaves looked at you with a mixture of envy and pity. They recognized the cost of what you had become, not merely obedience, but the burial of your own soul. Years in the house revealed the patterns of its cruelty. New slaves arrived from the markets, wide-eyed and trembling. The first months broke them through beatings, through symposium nights, through the slow erosion of hope. Some died quickly, others faded over time. Few lasted more than a handful of years before being discarded, sold to harsher fates in mines or quarries, or simply disappearing, their absence unremarked. You began to notice the rhythms of the masters as well. The guests rotated with predictable appetites, each one bringing the same demands, the same hypocrisies. A politician praised democracy at dawn, then silenced a crying slave at night with his fists. A philosopher spoke of virtue while justifying cruelty with the elegance of rhetoric. A merchant funded public works that bore his name in marble, even as his charity ended at the threshold of Lysander's hall. It was not ignorance, it was choice. Athens, the city hailed as the beacon of freedom, rested on these contradictions. Its democracy was for citizens alone, its philosophy for men with leisure, and that leisure was bought with the bodies of those who had none. Every temple, every statue, every line of poetry was shadowed by unseen suffering. You thought of this often while moving silently through the symposium halls, watching men debate the nature of justice while demanding you kneel at their feet. Their brilliance did not excuse them, it condemned them further. For if men who understood virtue still chose cruelty, then cruelty was not ignorance but will. Among the slaves, survival meant finding fragments of humanity wherever possible. Marcus, scarred and limping, taught you how to read moods so you could avoid the worst punishments. Philemon whispered stories of his family in the marketplace, keeping alive memories forbidden by Demetrius. Alexios hummed old songs when he thought no one listened, scraps of melody carried from a homeland now beyond reach. You created silent languages, glances, gestures, a touch on the shoulder to warn one another, to offer comfort in moments where words would be too dangerous. These were small rebellions, but they mattered. They were proof that you still existed beneath the silence imposed on you. But the system poisoned even this. Privileges dangled by Demetrius tempted some into betrayal. A warmer blanket, an easier duty, sometimes the price was turning against your own. Trust was fragile, always under threat. Even friendship, even solidarity, was weaponized into another chain. The years marked your body as surely as they hollowed your spirit. Scars from punishments, calluses from endless service. Shoulders bent, eyes lowered. You caught your reflection once in polished bronze and barely recognized yourself. Your voice, once quick and bright, had become flat, careful, stripped of its childhood lilt. Even your posture betrayed what you had become, hunched, wary, practiced in invisibility. And yet, in rare moments of stillness, you still remembered. The smell of your mother's garden, the sound of goats bleating in the Sunday, the laughter of children chasing one another through dust. These memories came less often, like distant music, faint but beautiful. They were both painful and precious reminders that you had once been more than this. Years passed. You watched younger boys arrive with frightened eyes, just as you once had. You saw them flinch at their first symposium, their spirits splinter under the weight of nights too long and cruelties too sharp. Some would look at you, searching for guidance, for hope. But what could you offer? Survival, yes, but living? That was long gone. You had become a ghost haunting your own body, and in Athens, that made you useful. Your usefulness waned as the years ground you down. The bruises healed slower, the joints ached longer, and the youth that had once made you valuable faded into something ordinary. New slaves arrived, fresh faces, trembling bodies, eyes wide with fear, and the guests' attention drifted toward them, leaving you overlooked. One morning, Demetrius summoned you. His words were flat, almost casual. You were to be sold to a mining camp in the mountains. Not punishment, not reward, merely economics. You were no longer worth the bread you consumed in a house that thrived on youth and beauty. But your body could still break rock. You knew what this meant. The mines were a death sentence. Not immediate, but inevitable. The tunnels were unstable, the air thick with choking dust, the labor endless. Slaves there lived months, perhaps a few years at most. No one returned. That night, Marcus, older now, gaunt but still alive, slipped something into your hand. A shard of metal, sharpened crudely. His eyes met yours, and though he said nothing, the meaning was clear. This is choice. Use it to open a lock, or to strike a guard, or to cut your own escape into death. You held the shard until dawn, turning over the possibilities. Escape? Impossible with chains and guards. Revenge? Brief, bloody, certain to end in agony. Suicide? A final dignity, yes, but then nothing more. In the end, you hid it where others might find it. The gift Marcus gave you would not end with you. Perhaps another would find courage, or freedom, or at least the mercy of choice. The journey to the mountains carried you through landscapes that reopened half-buried memories. Valleys like the one where you had been born. Streams that reminded you of childhood games. Villages that could have been your own. But you did not run. The chains were too heavy, the guards too watchful. Instead, you walked in silence, bidding farewell to the world with every step. The camp was worse than you imagined. Hundreds of slaves, gaunt and coughing, worked in tunnels that trembled with every strike of the pickaxe. Dust coated everything, skin, hair, lungs, until breathing felt like swallowing ash. Food was scarce, punishment swift, hope absent. Here, slaves were not even entertainment. They were tools to be broken and replaced. And yet, even in this final circle of despair, resistance flickered. Slaves shared scraps of food. They whispered names of loved ones, preserving fragments of cultures the overseers wanted erased. They told stories of families, of festivals, of lives stolen. In the darkest shafts of the mines, they bore witness to one another's humanity, refusing to let memory die. You, too, became part of that chorus. Your story was added to the oral chain. The boy sold from his village, the youth consumed by symposium nights, the hollow man who survived longer than expected. The others promised to remember your name, though history itself would not. The end came quietly. Your lungs, blackened by years of dust, finally surrendered. One collapse too many left you pinned, gasping in the dark. There was no drama, no defiance, only silence, and the hands of fellow slaves who promised to speak of you even after your body was gone. But stories do not die with bodies. They linger, echoing through time. For history remembers Athens as the cradle of democracy, the home of reason, the stage of great philosophers. Yet your life, and the lives of countless others, was the price of that golden age. The leisure that allowed men to debate virtue was built upon your chains. The beauty of temples was balanced against your suffering. Civilization's triumph rested on the silence of those it crushed. And though centuries separate their marble halls from our glass towers, the pattern endures. Children still disappear into systems of exploitation, traded for survival or profit. Factories and mines across the world still consume bodies too young, too fragile, while societies tell themselves stories of progress. Philosophers of our own age still debate justice while ignoring cruelty hidden in plain sight. The faces change, the tools of exploitation evolve, but the essential transaction does not. Some live in comfort because others are consumed. Some enjoy freedom because others are chained. Some build civilizations while others are erased from its record. You died in the dark, your name forgotten. But your story lingers in the whispers of history, a reminder that the marble columns of every age conceal shadows, that behind every golden age lies a graveyard of the voiceless. We admire Athens for its philosophy, its art, its politics. But beneath that admiration, we must ask, at what cost? The answer lies in your silence, in your chains, in the forgotten grave of civilization.